In this video, I'm going to talk about the introduction to your research paper. I'll go over how to organize it and also what goes into it to make a good introduction. Before we get into a little more detail, I wanted to cover a couple of key points. The first key point is that the intro is often used interchangeably with the term the literature review. And the reason for that is because in the intro, you, the author, are going to be reviewing a lot of the key articles out there on your given topic. So you're reviewing the literature out there on your topic. The second key point is that the purpose of the intro is to show the progression of how you went from a research problem to a research question to the rationale for your study. So it shows the progression. So you notice how that flows really logically. That's the purpose of the intro. The last key point I wanted to make is that it should conclude with the rationale for your study. So in doing so, you just reviewed all the literature, and in the rationale you identify the gap in the literature. So there's got to be something out there where there's something missing, there's a gap in the research, and that's the need that your study fulfills. Your study fills that gap, and it's needed for that reason. So your job is to explain what that gap is and how your study fills that gap. And last, in that section, you talk about your hypotheses and your predictions, and those predictions and hypotheses are based on past research. Okay, so let's get into the three major parts of the intro. Okay, so your introduction should begin with a discussion of the research problem. Give the reader a little context of what the paper is all about. A couple things to keep in mind. Number one is to begin broad. So this is a broad introduction into the problem, and then you get specific when you get to the rationale part of the intro. But to begin with, we're going to start really broad. Another thing to keep in mind is what's a good approach to how to structure the introduction. One approach is called the cut and band-aid approach. Well, how do you do this, and what is a cut and what's the band-aid? The cut is you really make the reader care about the research problem. You provide the cut. You cut them, make them care, draw them into the paper. And then you provide the band-aid, which is that proposed intervention that you're going to discuss in the latter part of your paper. Well, how do you do this? Well, what is this and how do you do that? One thing to do to make that story come to life is provide lots of statistics, lots of numbers, and talk about things like prevalence. But more importantly is, the last point here is talk about the impact on students, right? So we have lots and lots of students being impacted by this problem, and it's impacting them in all these different ways. So what might this look like? Let's talk about a very quick example here. So we have lots and lots of students who are being diagnosed with ADHD, and they're taking meds for ADHD. So we're going to provide numbers and statistics on the prevalence of this issue. Here's a major issue here. What's the impact? Well, it has a lot of negative effects. It can impact their health, their physical health. It can impact their social development, and it can impact their learning. So maybe we are going to find studies out there that also show it negatively impacts learning, even though it's supposed to do the opposite. So here we go. We have lots and lots of students affected by taking meds for ADHD. We have numbers and statistics to back that up. And we have lots of these negative health effects from the medication. So here's the cut. We provided a cut to the reader. We have a problem, and it's impacting these students in a great way. Okay, so we're continuing our discussion of the first part of the research paper introduction. We ended with the cut. We cut the reader, but we didn't provide that Band-Aid yet, so let's do that. The Band-Aid is your proposed intervention. So what I would do is I would mention really briefly a couple of studies that talked about this proposed intervention. and tell the reader this, let the reader know that there's a potential fix here for this problem. In our case, the fix is exercise. Believe it or not, exercise is a contemporary alternative treatment to ADHD rather than medication. So we're saying lots of students being diagnosed with ADHD are taking medicine and it's causing them negative health effects. However, there's a solution. Maybe we can use exercise as our intervention that doesn't have these negative health effects. Okay? The last thing we do in this first part of the intro is give a roadmap to the reader. This essentially lets the reader know what is to follow in the paper. Because otherwise, the reader will really have no idea of why this section is followed by that section and so forth. So this gives them a little heads up of what's to follow. Okay, so that concludes the first major part of the introduction, which is the research problem. In the next section, I'm going to talk about how to write the review of the literature part, which is part 2 of your intro. Okay, so now we're moving on to the second major section of your introduction, and that's the review of literature. Notice that I did leave the previous component, roadmap, from the section 1 of your introduction because I wanted to make the point that this all segues into each other. So this first section segues into the review of literature. Now in this section, this is going to be the bulk of your intro. So this is going to take up most of the pages that you write for your introduction. Another key point is to use headings. Make sure you use headings. Headings are your friend with regard to an APA research paper. And one of the reasons for that is because they help organize the paper. They help organize it so the reader knows what section they're in, and also kind of serves as a working outline for yourself as you're writing the paper. Another key point to make is claims versus evidence. Okay, so what does that mean? What do I mean by that? Well, many students will write something such as Johnson 2010 claim blah 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 reported that students should not use medication to treat ADHD, period, and then go on to a whole nother paragraph. Well, if I did something like that, this would actually be a claim. A lot of students will think that this serves as evidence, but it really doesn't. It doesn't serve as evidence unless this is accompanied by some type of results, right? So some numbers, some data, if you will, to back up this claim. Let me give you a little more idea of what I'm talking about. So Johnson 2010 claimed that students shouldn't use medication to treat ADHD. Well, how did Johnson 2010 go about concluding that or coming to that claim? Did he or she conduct a study in which students who were diagnosed with ADHD were separated into two groups, and they did X, Y, Z in terms of methodology? Well, that all needs to be talked about in this discussion. This is why this is called the review of literature, because you're kind of giving a little more detail here with what Johnson did. So talk about, what were the methods, and this is just real brief, it doesn't have to be too long, who the participants were. For example, what was the age group, how many there were, and so forth. But more importantly, what were the results? So it's really not enough to say something improved or scores increased, right? Because my biggest question to you, and you probably saw this on some of your papers, is, well, what does that mean? Improved? Improved how much? I have no idea what that means. Because if you say, well, Johnson 2010 says that reading scores increased by doing this, well, that increase really could be as little as 1 point, right? So when you say things like significant or improved or decreased or something, I really need to know those numbers. I need to know the results because it gives me, the reader, a little context, gives the story a little more life. Okay, so now we're on to the final section of your introduction, and that's the rationale for your study. Notice that I put purpose statement in parentheses here, and I wanted to make a quick point that you want to make this section very explicit to the reader. Make it really clear that here is the rationale for the study. So I would actually go ahead and have a separate heading, a level 2 heading called purpose statement or statement of purpose or even just purpose. You might have even noticed that in some of the review of literature that you did and some of the articles that you read. You might have seen this mentioned in those studies. And you want to do the same for your study too. So have a separate heading titled something similar to purpose statement. So really what your goal here, there's 3 things that you want to accomplish in this final section. And this doesn't need to be too long. I'm thinking probably about on the lines of about one paragraph or so, maybe 2. You want to kind of wrap your head around answering these questions as you write this section. What is the purpose of the study? Well, that's kind of a hard thing to answer sometimes. So let's look at how do we do that in relation to this first one. How does it build on past research? So how does your study build on the research that already exists? Maybe, for example, we're going to stick with the medication and ADHD example. Maybe most of the studies out there have looked at exercise treatment for ADHD, but they've done so with high school students, and they haven't done the same type of research with elementary school students. So how does it build on it? Well, it adds to the body of knowledge by testing the effects of exercise for treatment for ADHD with a completely different and new population. So the purpose of the study is that it builds on this past research. So one thing to keep in mind is you want to identify the gap. What's the gap in the research? Another way to think about this is, what's the niche for your research? Maybe past research has looked at certain populations, but not this population. For example, maybe they looked at general ed students, but not special ed students, or vice versa. So there's a gap in the research. So the niche, if you will, to your study is that it fills the gap in a very unique way. It works with special ed students compared to regular ed students and so forth. Okay? So the important point here, another important point, is to make sure that this discussion mentions past research. And in doing that, make sure that you talk about how it builds and make sure you have those citations in there and so forth. All right? The last thing to do in this section is your hypotheses. These are sometimes called predictions too, so you can term it either way, it doesn't really matter. But you're going to predict certain things. You're going to predict that, for example, middle school students who exercise are going to have less target behaviors of ADHD than students who take medication or something like that. But notice that this prediction or this hypothesis needs to be based on this past research. It really can't come out of thin air. It needs to be based on all this past research. Okay, so that concludes. Okay, so I wanted to take a moment to summarize everything that we've just discussed with regard to the introduction. So here are the 3 major parts of the intro, and your intro should be modeled in a similar fashion and flow in the same type of manner. So it begins with talking about the problem in a broad way, and we're going to talk about numbers and statistics and really draw the reader into the paper by providing that cut, right? And then that progresses into your research question, where you mention that perhaps this might be a solution to that problem and so forth. The next major part of your intro is the review of literature, where you will spend most of your time in your introduction talking about past research, and the key point there is the evidence. So make sure that you bring up lots of evidence instead of just claims. You need the actual numbers to provide the evidence to back up what point you're trying to make. And then the final part of the intro is the rationale, or the purpose statement, where you make it clear to the reader, hey, here's the purpose of this paper. There's a gap in the research, and this paper fills the purpose of filling that gap, or the purpose of this paper is to fill this gap in this particular way, and based on past research, here are my hypotheses.